So good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the delay. We were waiting on a couple of commissioners to join us. So thank you for joining us today. I am Amelia Boyd, and I'm the program manager for the commission and the organizer of this webinar. This meeting is being recorded and will be made available sometime next week. The documents which will be discussed here today are available in the handout section and on our website, which is wmc.wa.gov. All attendees are muted. Panelists may unmute themselves and share their webcam. Attendees, if you have a question, please use the raise your hand function or use the questions section, and I will get to your questions as quickly as possible. Please refer to the agenda for the topics to be discussed. And then at this time, I will begin the roll call for the folks that are here. So if Dr. Jager, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi there, this is April Jager. I'm one of the Washington Medical Commission commissioners. I'm not sure what all information you want, Amelia, but
That's good enough. So, and next, Christine Blake, if you could introduce yourself.
Christine Blake, Washington Medical Commissioner.
And then Heather, if you could go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, Heather Carter. I'm an Assistant Attorney General, and I advise both the Medical Commission and the Osteopathic Medical Board.
Thank you, Heather. And then Dr. Domino.
Hello, I'm Karen Domino. I'm one of the commissioners.
And then Dr. Morissette.
Hi, I'm Kim Morissette, part of the Board of Osteopathic Medicine.
Thank you. And Dr. Galbraith, or Galbraith. I may be mispronouncing that. My apologies. Oh, she may have stepped away. Melanie.
Hello, I'm Melanie DeLeon. I'm the Executive Director of the Medical Commission.
And Mike.
I'm Mike Farrell. I'm on the Medical Commission staff. I serve as the Policy Development Manager.
And then Renee.
Hi, I'm Renee Fullerton, Executive Director for the Board of Osteopathic Medicine and Surgery.
And then Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Mason. I'm the Legislative Liaison for the Washington Medical Commission.
And then Tracy.
Hi, I'm Tracy Drake. I am the Program Manager for the Board of Osteopathic Medicine and Surgery.
And then we'll go back to Dr. Galbraith.
Yep, can you hear me now? I think I was muted before.
Yes, you're good now.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Galbraith, and I was going to say, yeah, you got my name right the second time, so thank you. Okay. And I am one of the representatives from the Washington Osteopathic Board.
All right, thank you. And then Christine, if you would like to go ahead and read our script for us, please.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Christine Blake. I will be the presiding officer for this rules workshop. Today is Friday, December 18th, 2020, and it is 3:09 p.m. The meeting is being held via the GoToWebinar platform. The rule being discussed today is regarding telemedicine. The pre-proposal rules package was filed in the Washington State Register as 19-19-072 on September 17th, 2019. If there are any questions about the rule process, please input them into the questions section. At this time, the panel will begin the discussion regarding the definition of telemedicine. The definition in our draft language is on the screen momentarily. The recommended definitions are in the packet and begin on page 9. We will also consider the definition from Oregon, which will be on the screen momentarily. Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm Mike Farrell. Before we begin the discussion of the definition of the term telemedicine, I wanted to clarify an issue that has generated a lot of consternation and confusion. The definition of telemedicine in the draft contains a sentence that says telemedicine does not include audio-only telephone, email, fax, and U.S. mail. I thought it'd be helpful to explain right at the beginning why that sentence is there, what the effect is, and then offer an alternative. First, We exclude in the draft audio-only phone calls because we wanted to be consistent with the legislature's definition of telemedicine, which can be found in the reimbursement statute, which is RCW 43.48.735. And this statute excludes audio-only telephone. This is a standard exclusion in many states in their definitions of telemedicine. So second, what does this mean? By excluding audio-only telephone, it means that phone calls do not fall within the scope of the rule. The rule as drafted does not regulate phone calls. It doesn't mean a physician can't treat a patient using the phone. It just means that when a physician treats a patient over the phone, the physician does not have to comply with the requirements of the rule. Phone calls are not regulated by the rule. I want to make it clear that the commission can, of course, define telemedicine in any way it chooses. It does not have to follow the legislature's definition. The commission, of course, is not concerned with reimbursement. The purpose of the draft rule is to set standards for physicians to follow when using telemedicine. In other words, simply to preserve the standard of care. So I want to conclude by saying that to avoid future confusion over the effect of this sentence, the commission can consider dropping the sentence entirely. And if it does this, then it would be including audio-only communication within the scope of the rule. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Now we'll discuss two of the comments we've received. The first is from OCHIN. The panel will begin the no?
Sorry.
Amelia? Sorry.
We haven't done our discussion of the
Sorry.
definition.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's
yes.
after we finish. Sorry.
Sorry. Discussion of the definition. Go ahead.
So the recommendations we've received are in the packet, as we mentioned, and then we hope to today consider all of these items on the screen, and Mike just talked about the audio only, including the phone calls. So the panelists can discuss this, and you can consider these 4 things, and then we have all of those other recommended definitions. Again, we do not have to come up with a firm definition today, but it would be nice if we could get somewhere close. And then we will also consider, which was not included in the packet previously, Oregon's definition, which is now on the screen, which simply says telemedicine means the provision of health services to patients by physicians and healthcare practitioners from a distance using electronic communications. So with that, I will leave it up to the panel to start their discussion.
So it looks to me like Oregon has just lumped everything into electronic communications, which would be phone calls, texts, video, right? So Mike, ours is a little bit more broad, but this seems to encompass everything. Or maybe ours is just wordier.
May I ask what the downside is of including the telephone versus or audio only in our rule versus not having it included, and how that will impact access to care?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I don't think it has any effect whatsoever on access to care. If we exclude phone calls from the definition of telemedicine, it has no impact on any physician's ability to pick up the phone and call a patient or talk to a patient on the phone. By including it, it means that that activity, that phone call between the doctor and the patient, falls within the scope of the rule, and therefore that doctor has to provide informed consent, keep records, ensure privacy and security, properly establish the physician-patient relationship. And you're probably thinking, well, you do that every time you see a patient anyway. The rule is intended to make sure that when a physician has a interaction with a patient via telemedicine, that they comply with what most people would consider our standard practices in medicine. It wouldn't affect any access to care. The legal effect of having telephone calls within the definition of telemedicine is that anybody picking up the phone or talking to a patient on the phone would have to comply with each one of these provisions. So you'd have to look at the rule and decide for yourself whether these provisions would be appropriate to a phone call. Personally, I think it'd be simpler to simply include phone calls within the definition.
But by that means you'd have to, if you're on then communicating by phone, you have to go through obtaining consent and all of that just to be covered. I guess, like, how would that be different than our current practice of picking up the phone and, you know, having communication with the patient? Would this change that?
I don't think so. I'm not a physician, but I don't think anything in this rule would have any impact on a physician having telephone communication with a patient.
I had one question though. There's a lot about a physical examination, and a physical exam, perhaps an auditory one, could be done over the telephone call. But unless you have some electronic capability of having visual input, it would be hard to do a physical exam. So it seemed silly to include a phone call, simple phone call, in this rule.
Yeah, the language on physical exams, I think, has an out. It says, shall interview the patient to collect the relevant medical history and perform a physical examination when medically necessary, sufficient for the diagnosis and treatment of the patient.
That's pretty hard to do on a, I mean, I was concerned over the physical exam portion of it, even for video, because you can get a general appearance. You could maybe have someone stand or sit, but depending on what other modalities one uses, it would be hard to do a more detailed exam, such as a neurologic exam beyond some simple motor function. Maybe hard to listen to breath sounds unless you're hearing someone audibly having difficulty breathing, and that.
But correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, you don't have to do a physical exam every time, right? Only if it's required or it would be needed for a diagnosis.
I would say yes, Melanie, but I'm hearing Dr. Domino's comments and looking at the language. I think we need to make that language more clear that a physical exam is not required every time for this very reason.
Okay, I would agree with that.
I would agree with that. Sorry, Melanie. This is April. I would agree with that as well. The way it was written was worrisome from a practitioner standpoint, that even though if I was in a telemedicine situation and felt that I could make a diagnosis, of course, it would always be better if I could do the exam in person, and I would always have more information if I could do that. So it just made it feel uncomfortable that I was always supposed to be doing an exam unless I could do so over the phone just as well, which would never really be the case.
I didn't know if there's any benefit to having the telephone, audio only telephone. I mean, it seems like this rule gives a lot of requirements as opposed to a simple phone call or a simple, perhaps, email correspondence. But that's just my opinion about it.
Could, when I'm reading telemedicine includes real-time interactive services, store and forward technologies. store and forward technologies, what do you mean by, what do we mean by that?
Those are asynchronous communication. It's used by radiologists and pathologists and anybody looking at images, any information that is sent and then looked at later.
Okay. I
As
just wanted
opposed to real time.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to make sure I was looking at that the right way when I read it.
I think we define it in the draft. Yeah, we do.
Yeah,
We do.
we do. Well,
Mike, is there any advantage to including telephone calls and email correspondence as opposed to what we usually think of as, for instance, video conferencing, which is different, or perhaps a phone call with a video? Can't video conferencing be done on phones? I mean, because you don't want to exclude people who don't have internet capability and computers and that kind of thing.
I guess that's a subjective determination whether there's an advantage. If you include phone calls, then it comes under the scope of the rule. As I said before, we have received many comments from people asking us to delete that sentence and include telephone, audio-only telephone within the scope of within the definition of telemedicine.
And I assume that deals with access of patients, since not everyone, I mean, people have a phone, but they may not have a video capability, is my understanding of some of the.
I think it mainly has to do with reimbursement. And I would invite anybody who knows more about this than I do to speak about it, but the reimbursement statute excludes it, telephone, and I think that's a problem for a number of companies.
This is Stephanie. I just wanted to weigh in real quick. I think one of the reasons our first draft was so detailed is that it kind of matches the current statute, and it also matches the federal statute that is outside of the emergency orders that have been issued for COVID. But because of that, we're kind of all looking at things differently, and state statute might also be changing. So the definition from Oregon, while much less detailed, actually gives us a lot more room to interpret any movement at the state or federal level into our rules, which will be coming out kind of later after some of the state laws may have passed this session. If that helps you in determining which one you would prefer.
I think it sounds like the Oregon rule is a good idea.
I agree.
Is there any way for you to put the Oregon one up on the screen again? I had it, but I can't see it now.
Amelia, we're looking for the Oregon definition.
Oh,
Yeah, you have
sorry.
Yeah.
That seems pretty encompassing.
Yeah, pretty clean.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially given that this technology and this sort of field of practice is going to be likely to increase in frequency as well as to change over time, just because the tech is going to change. It may be helpful to have a less detailed definition, just so that it can encompass new technology as it arises.
Yeah, I agree. It will change. It will continue to change over time. We wouldn't want to tie ourselves in.
I want to point out the first sentence of our definition is very close to that. And then we have a second sentence that adds some specificity by saying what it includes. Maybe you should say includes but not limited to real-time interactive services, store and forward technologies, interpretive services, and remote monitoring. If you have the Oregon definition, we're going to get phone calls saying, does it include remote monitoring, for example? And maybe that's okay. Maybe the Oregon definition is the best one. I just thought I wanted to point out that we have a second sentence that adds some activity that someone might think doesn't fall within that definition.
Yeah, I like that, Mike, actually a lot. I think something like includes but not limited to, and then stop after that period and then take off for the purposes of this rule does not include, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. That makes it really clean and not so wordy that it confuses the reader a little bit. So
I have a quick thought. So one question that always comes to me in writing rules is in getting back to the idea of intent and wanting to ensure patient safety. And so phone calls have been going on for a long time, as long as we've had the phone. I'm sure there've been doctors providing telephone healthcare services. Are we concerned enough with the state of the phone calls that we feel these rules are necessary to regulate that conduct?
Well, I think if we're requiring a standard of care be met by a physician and protect the public, then I think the interaction on the phone should meet that same standard and not be exempt.
I don't know, to me, a phone call is a phone call, and there are a lot of requirements that seem unnecessary and onerous. And I mean, just even the consent, the privacy, that sort of thing. I don't know. That's just my physician opinion.
Yeah, it's an interesting to see in the rules that there's supposed to be informed consent so that the patient is aware of the limitations of telemedicine practice and the, sort of benefits, risks and benefits therein, et cetera, and that all that's supposed to be available to them and they can look up all of my credentials, so on and so forth for every telemedicine exchange. Feels very onerous with regards to someone making a follow-up phone call for a provider that they're covering, or it's just the casual conversation where you might be relaying information to a patient, or wherein they call a clinic or a hospital to get information before coming in, et cetera. It starts to get really tricky because, of course, no one's doing informed consent over the phone for any of that. And if you have a typical in-person practice and you occasionally are talking to patients over the phone, I highly doubt that practices have somewhere in their fine print that they make people sign off on informed consent about telemedicine rules and regulations.
I agree with Dr. Yeager. I understand the need for those that are practicing truly virtually and providing all their services via a video platform, that there needs to be some kind of structure to that. But for everybody else who includes the phone as part of their way and method of communicating with patients, having to add any further work to an already very onerous day, it just seems to be not necessary. So I feel in order to, and I don't think that that's a protecting the public piece. That's already on in a way that the patient has already kind of established that relationship with the physician, and vice versa. So.
Well, Mike, couldn't you carve out some, I mean, different, not set of rules, but circumstances for follow-up phone calls or phone calls by like my PCP when we talk? I don't go through uninformed consent because I've been going to the same doctor forever and ever. So, I mean, couldn't there be different set of circumstances for that kind of a visit?
Yeah, I think it wouldn't be too hard to draft some type of language to give discretion to a physician on a phone call about some of these requirements, including informed consent or physical exam. I think we can do that.
Mike, from what I'm hearing you say, did you perhaps find value in the second sentence on our definition combined with the organ as kind of a then comprehensive definition that everybody seems to kind of agree with? That's kind of what I've heard from people on the phone.
I think so, yes. I think the second sentence adds clarity. If we add the words not limited to, included but not limited to.
Right.
Right.
Does anybody have an issue with any of those items? For example, remote monitoring being part of telemedicine?
Can somebody
No.
give an example of what that means?
You can monitor heartbeats. For instance, there are telephone devices that pick up people's heartbeat. Someone could a physician could monitor the EKG on that and make a diagnosis whether someone's in atrial fibrillation per se, as an example of that. It can also include, there are new devices coming out that are based on phones that assess breathing sounds, and you can tell if someone's having airway obstruction or whether they've stopped breathing. In fact, you can even tell this sound sort of thing based on 911 calls. So I think that to me is something I would put into remote monitoring of that.
So we do have a couple of questions if we want to deal with those right now. And then also we have someone with their hand up. If we want to take that question right now, the person with their hand up, if that's okay. Hearing no dissent, I will unmute them. I believe it's Dr. Edwards. You can ask your question now if you'd like. I will get those questions up on the screen. Hold on just a moment. Okay. Okay, you should be able to see those questions now.
Well, for that first question, it seems like we addressed this already by kind of changing our definition to meet the Oregon definition more.
And I agree with the comment about audio and removing the phone altogether.
Yeah, that's a good comment.
And then we have another question that says, should you include specific reference to surgery robot like the Da Vinci?
That's not really telemedicine. The Da Vinci is controlled, well, unless I'm wrong, but that's controlled real time in the OR.
Yeah, the Da Vinci is a OR as far as I know.
But it can be
Surgical.
controlled elsewhere, perhaps. That's one of the future things.
Or maybe we could not say Da Vinci itself and just.
I wouldn't say anything, to
Yeah.
be honest. I
Right.
think,
Yeah, maybe
whatever
not.
that
Yeah.
terminology for the radiologists would fit that.
Right. And theirs is not, I don't recall it exactly, but it's not Da Vinci.
Maybe I'm
Probably
wrong.
want to use
but
a general.
Sorry, doesn't
Sorry, go
the
ahead.
first sentence cover that, regardless of whether or not it's live? It's not with the patient, right? I think you'd have to go back to the working definition.
I didn't hear the first part of your question. I'm sorry. Do you mind saying it again?
If you want to repeat the question, Amelia, I can repeat my answer. I'm not sure what you were looking for.
The last question was, should you include specific reference to surgery robot like the Da Vinci?
Right. And so what I'm saying is in the second half of our first sentence under the working definition, where the healthcare provider is in one location and the patient is in another, would include all current technology like the Da Vinci and then all forthcoming that offers that same option.
I guess I'm just saying that the Da Vinci robot, you're usually in the room with the patient. It's not remote.
Right. Someone's working that that robot in the OR.
So
They have done it with people in different locations. Micah Matthews was sharing with me some information about that a while ago, about how they have done it with the surgeon actually being located miles away. So that is coming on the horizon.
Through the Da Vinci
technology. It is coming. These technologies are really changing, and so there's a lot of, we need to be flexible.
So should we put more of a broad definition in rather than using Da Vinci itself, because that could change over time with other manufacturers as well? We're putting a manufacturer name in.
Yeah,
Isn't
that's what
that
I'm saying.
real-time interactive services and storing force?
Yeah.
I would just leave it.
Because you have an includes but is not limited to.
Yep.
And I think it falls under real-time interactive services. I really wouldn't call out a specific brand name.
Okay. So Barry Edwards still has their hand up. I will attempt to unmute them again.
Okay, just wanted to point out that standard of care is always something you try to determine at the time of the encounter. And actually, speaking of the word encounter, I think that's a lot better way to say it now that covers all of these kinds of things rather than seeing the patient, because obviously now we don't always see the patient, but you can say we have a phone-only encounter. So again, every time you talk to the patient on the phone, you determine whether what standard, what setting is required. For example, I had a problem a couple of weeks ago. I sent a message to UW eCare system, and the nurse came back to me and said, send me a picture. So I took a picture and sent it to them. And with that, we determined what to do next. So there's always, if you see a patient in the office, you're going to determine whether they need to be going to urgent care or whether they need to go to the emergency room. That's always part of every patient encounter. And I agree with not using the word Da Vinci, by the way. That was the only robot I know of, so I mentioned that.
Thank you. And then we also have a hand raised from Brenda Chapman. If you are available, I will unmute you.
Oh, hello. I'm speaking as a patient, and I didn't realize that I had raised my hand, but I've been thinking of a question. Take your time. Thank you so much. My question is regarding the coordination of these definitions. Washington State is making their own definition. Oregon is making theirs. Alaska will have theirs. And I live in the area of Peace Health. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Oh,
yes.
Okay, great. And there's physician care between Alaska, Washington State, and Oregon. How would that work if each of those states has their own telemedicine definition? So you're speaking to the company of Peace Health, and through that you might live in one state but speak to the physician in another state. Has there been any thought about how that works where different states have different definitions? Say the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota has a different definition than the Mayo Clinic in Arizona. That was my thought.
I can give that a shot. Yeah, different states are going to have different definitions of telemedicine. There's a principle that the practice of medicine takes place where the patient is. So if you're in Washington being treated by a physician in Alaska, then that physician in Alaska has to comply with the laws of the state of Washington. So if they're treating you via telemedicine and this rule passes, then they have to comply with this rule, not the rules or statutes of the state of Alaska.
Okay, now we have 3 other hands raised, so I will unmute Denny Lorden. Okay. They may be having some trouble.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you go.
Sorry about that. Denny Lorden with Providence Telehealth. I just wanted to make a suggestion, and this is actually in your packet on page 10, where the American Telemedicine Association gives a good broad definition of interactive telecommunications to include asynchronous and remote patient monitoring. And as we all know, we try not to restrict ourselves in telehealth to what's coming down the road, but be cognizant of patient safety and things like that. I think where we run into trouble is when we create different definitions in different states around telehealth, and we have unintended consequences with the interpretation of those rules. And that's particularly challenging for those of us, like in the Washington State Telehealth Collaborative, for example, is in how do we interpret those rules and modify as necessary. So the more we can leave them broad and open, but safely delivered, I think the better position we are going down the road. And then I just wanted to offer one example of remote patient monitoring. A good one was given. At Providence, we monitor COVID patients at home using, connected devices and non-connected devices and things like that, with the intent of keeping appropriate patients out of the hospital and keeping our beds available. So that's one of the up-and-coming emerging technologies that we want to make sure we have available to us.
Thank you. Were there any comments from the panel?
Yeah, I was wondering, the last comment or suggestion then was that we include the sentence asynchronous and synchronous, or that he was looking to replace something in the second line with that phrase.
It seems like remote monitoring should cover that.
I don't know if you can allow him to weigh in again, Amelia, but.
Did you want to clarify anything for Stephanie Denny?
We do consider remote patient monitoring, or RPM, asynchronous technology, so that's correct.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Did you have more to add, Denny? Sorry.
Nope, good to go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I actually like the American Telemedicine Association's definition. To me, it seems straightforward, and if it is, I do understand, you know, each state, you have 50 states. It's nice to have something that's more uniform, and if that is a definition that might be used in more than one state, it seems to have advantages.
Any other comments on that? Okay, so the next person that has their hands raised is Kyle Zebley. Oh, I don't know what's happening. Hold on. Okay, I've
Oh, hi,
there
hi,
we go.
can you hear me?
There
Amelia?
you go. Yes.
So sorry about that. Thank you so very much to you and to your fellow commissioners. Kyle Zebley here. I'm actually the director of the director of public policy, excuse me, of the American Telemedicine Association. And so obviously I would have to second very much what was just said by my friend Denny from Providence, and really show appreciation for Karen Domino's comment just now as well. Just that we really do think the definition we put forth and the modality neutral policies that kind of underpin it would be something that we would recommend respectfully to the commission as they consider defining telehealth. It's really important that we don't limit ourselves unduly by having too restrictive of a definition, and of course standardizing the definitions across the states certainly would be very helpful from our perspective. And so we're so appreciative of the work you're doing here. It's so important, and thanks for allowing me to just really say a comment more than a question. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Any comments for Mr. Zebley? All right. Next up, we have David Streeter, who I believe is from WSHA.
Hi, can you?
Oh, go ahead.
Hi, my name is David Streeter, and I'm with the Washington State Hospital Association. Would it be possible for you to go back to your working definition slide? Oh. Okay, well, while that's queuing up here, I guess I have a question. You mentioned at the start of the meeting that you were looking to, or that you had started with the statutory definition as a starting point, and now we have this working definition. And I guess the question that I have from sort of the evolution of this is, in our statutory definition, we have a very clear statement that really scopes what can be provided via telemedicine, and that's for the purposes of diagnosis, consultation, and treatment. Is there a reason why that's not included in your either your draft definition that you started with, or in the definition that you're working with now?
I can't think of a reason. Do you think that's obviously you think that's important to put that in there?
Yes, I mean, we do think that there should be some type of scoping to this, mostly to ensure that that telemedicine is being used for the appropriate purpose. And, you know, in our statute, we allow it, you know, we specify that it's for those purposes. And in this definition, it might make sense to align that with statute.
Are there any other comments, Mike?
Yeah, I'm looking for, if somebody has that right in their suggestion. It's 98.6. Can you put that on the screen, Amelia?
Sure.
Because I think this is an issue worth talking about. I want to get the panel's thoughts on this. So if you look at that first sentence there, I think what David is talking about is the last clause there, for the purpose of diagnosis, consultation, or treatment.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly it.
Yeah, and I want to know what our panel thinks about adding this to our working definition. So it's not just any communication, David. It's probably what we're talking about, but it makes it clear: diagnosis, consultation, and treatment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really to make it reflective of what's in our current statute. You know, if that were to change, that would be a different conversation. But at least for now, that's what's on the books in the state.
Yeah, and to remind everybody, the current statute is designed for reimbursement. And our purpose is to set standards for telemedicine, standard of care, not reimbursement.
Could you say telemedicine means the delivery of healthcare services for the purposes of diagnosis, consultation, or treatment through the use of telecommunications technology by a healthcare provider? Blah, blah, blah.
Well, then we get into the consultation issue that I just spent 3 weeks of my life trying to figure out.
I don't know that adding that does anything to improve on healthcare services. I mean, I suppose it could add some clarity if someone were to dig down into each adjective, but as far as matching the statute, I think the intention is the same, unless what I'm hearing is that by the verbiage being different, there's some kind of like reciprocity or billing. I mean, I don't know about the billing side of the equation, but that isn't really what we're trying to get at with the rules. Maybe you'll have to help me out, Mike, if I'm getting too far in the weeds, but it doesn't seem like it helps us to add more under that. It seems like healthcare services covers it without diagnosis, consultation, and treatment. I don't know.
David, is there a communication or delivery of healthcare services that do not involve consultation, diagnosis, or treatment that we would want to exclude from the definition?
I would need to check on that to see if there are specific things we would want to exclude. But I think, you know, having that purpose, that scope in there, you know, at least from our perspective, would be helpful in just ensuring that there's a, you know, a specified use for it. But I can certainly get back to the commission on that through written comments.
I think that including diagnosis, consultation, and treatment doesn't include kind of follow-up or ongoing communication, which may take place in a subsequent visit that's the diagnosis is already made or the consultation has already started. And I think the healthcare services is all encompassing and would include all of those types of interactions.
And I prefer
So-
healthcare services as well because it is less specific, and the follow-up is, I mean, maybe that's a consultation. I have no idea. I find these words too specific. Healthcare services is broad.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't think of what would not be diagnosis, consultation, and treatment, but if we're trying to start from a broader base, I think leaving it at healthcare services is all-encompassing.
I would agree with that.
So remove that piece. Sorry.
I think that's what I'm hearing is consensus to remove diagnosis, consultation, and treatment, at least for now, and then written comments are going to be provided for more clarity.
Any other comments on that? And then, so we have a few more hands. The next one is, I believe it's Tori, who I'm going to butcher this last name, Lalamont? Oh, try that again, sorry.
Oh, hi, I'm Tori Lalamont from 98.6. I'm general counsel there, and I was going to comment, you're brave to even try to pronounce my name. So the one thing I would just point out in terms of deletion of and leaving it as broad as healthcare services, personally, or as I see it, I think healthcare services and leaving it broad is appropriate, as long as there's no issue that this would almost be too broad to wind up sweeping in something that you don't intend. Like I'm thinking about a portal where a patient can go on and see test results or something along those lines. There could be kind of some gray areas I think that could emerge, and if you leave it limited to healthcare services, my fear is just that I don't know, there could be something that pops up that gets swept up in this definition that you don't intend to.
Any comments? All right, moving on. The next person is Peter Hantal.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm a licensee and I'm the chief medical officer at Amwell. And I applaud your work here. I think you're doing great work. I also applaud the initial comment in this comment stream from the patient. I'm sorry, I don't remember her name. I thought that was a very insightful comment. I really just have a comment on maybe from my vantage point. We certainly are advocates. Those of us that are advocating for modernization of telehealth rules and laws advocate for consistency to the extent possible across states. And we understand states have different priorities and different geographies and all that kind of stuff. But consistency. The other point I was going to make is I'm sure you're all well aware of the FSMB model telehealth policies. They may be getting a little outdated at this point. But that may be another reference if you're looking for kind of the North Star in terms of what's the most consistent definitions or others out there, unless it's becoming a little out of date as technology advances. We're increasingly, and from my vantage point, we provide software for providers all over the country practicing telehealth, and increasingly we're seeing models that cross state lines and confusion with providers. Second opinion, and this is not my business, second opinion services like Cleveland Clinic and others, remote patient monitoring services, cancer care is now beginning to be more of a national offering rather than a state-based offering. So just, I guess, encouraging consistency. And I'm sorry, one last point. We find that there tends to be more tactical language, more granular language when it comes to reimbursement mandates or reimbursement policies with payers or CMS. And you know, and that seems reasonable to justify paying a bill for an encounter, whether you met CPT criteria and those kinds of things. Obviously, your interests are different. Your interests are more around protecting the citizens of the state and ensuring good quality care. So I just would advocate for being as general as possible, but with the caveat that my colleague at 98.6 just said, that you're not being too broad, that you're including things that weren't intended.
Thank you. Any comments on that?
I guess I'd like to see what other groups have. I mean, we heard the one from the American Telemedicine Association that seemed quite reasonable to me. There are a lot of people working in this space nationally, and I really think that we should now not have 50 different definitions of this in the US.
One thing that I also like that the association had in theirs, and it's just a minor thing, but it said telemedicine means the delivery of a healthcare services through the use of telecommunications technology by a healthcare provider in one location and a patient, and they had or a healthcare provider added to that in another location. And it's just a few little words, but I just like that they included or other healthcare provider. I actually like their definition as well. Or a practitioner, the way they had it written there. So it's not just typically the patient, it could be a practitioner.
So did we want to make a change to our working definition or move on to the next questions?
I don't think there's any sorry.
Go
I don't think there's harm in adding you or a practitioner. That offers some clarity that wasn't previously there.
Mike, do you see any concerns from your standpoint if we were to use the telemedicine association definition just to be consistent?
I don't, Dr. Jager. I think that's a good definition. I assume you're talking about the American Telemedicine Association definition.
I am.
Yeah, I think that's a fine definition.
And it may, I mean, it's something that's, if you will, been vetted by a group of people who do this specifically. And if we don't have any qualms against it, it seems like perhaps adopting that for the sake of consistency and clarity for our telemedicine providers might be beneficial.
I echo Dr. Jager's statement.
This is Heather Carter. I just had one comment on this that you might want to think about. If you do include that as the definition, then what you have now in your policy about allowing practitioner to practitioner consultations and that which you have right now is outside of a licensing requirement might look like now if you're going to do that, you need to be licensed in Washington. So we just want to think that through. If you're somehow inadvertently, by including that provider to provider contact within the definition, if you're then also requiring that both those providers to be licensed here in Washington.
That would be a problem, I think. A lot of this is because you can reach experts from outside your state. And Mayo Clinic and Cleveland Clinic are examples of those sort of experts that people may wish to discuss with. I mean, perhaps whatever the rule, one could carve out some sort of rule to allow them to not be licensed in the state.
And that practice is already happening outside of telemedicine. I mean, that's maybe not every day, but it's often that you're communicating with somebody from outside of your state who's involved in the patient care, and via whether it's through coordination of care or in order to best serve the patient. These conversations do happen even though that other person might not be licensed.
And Heather, you were concerned about the exemption in 652.
Yeah, I think I would just be concerned that by adding in the practitioner part of the American Telemedicine Association's definition, that you might inadvertently be taking away sort of what you have now, where practitioners call each other all the time or call their colleague who may be an expert in a certain area just to get information or opinion on a client or on a patient. So that's just my concern. Yeah, is that we don't inadvertently include that type of practice and then set up all these requirements plus a licensing requirement.
Yeah, so we have, what we're trying to do is exempt the peer-to-peer consultation further on in the draft. But I also know that this is going to be considered by the legislature this session, the peer-to-peer consultation, and possibly creating an exemption for physicians in other states to consult with licensed physicians here.
Heather, did you see that same hiccup in our working definition if we didn't add the practitioner element?
Yeah, so I think if you left that little piece out, then I think you don't end up with that question or kind of making it a little bit unclear, I think.
Right.
So with all that in mind, do we want to make any changes to our working definition?
You mean
I
if
would
we're
like to
taking
ask.
the American Telemedicine Association recommendation as the working definition?
No, if we leave the working definition as it was. Perhaps Mike or some of the other legal minds could tell me, what are the difficulties with states having a patchwork of definitions? Does it equal something on the federal level that's then really complicated for larger health systems? Have we lost anything by not doing that?
Well, I think one of the many entities talk about the barriers to the advancement of telemedicine, and one of the barriers is the differences among the states. So that's a big issue, and I think many people on the line today would probably agree with that. I don't see a big difference between our working definition and the ATA definition. I think the ATA definition is just fine.
Except for probably possibly the part that Heather called to our attention. Yeah.
No, that can be
highlighted.
No, I don't think that's a problem. She's just saying be careful that you don't later imply that that person needs to be licensed, and that's taken care of in the next section. And we can, I mean, that's a great warning, but we need to be careful that we don't imply that that person outside of Washington has to be licensed. We need to make that clear, but we can do that, I think.
So is that what I'm hearing, that we want to change our working definition to be the ATA's definition?
I believe that's what I heard from the commissioners on the line.
Yes.
I am happy with that.
Okay.
Yep, me too.
All right, so we have a couple of questions, and then there is, well, right now there's no hands raised. Actually, Peter, you still have your hand raised, but I'm not sure if you meant to, so I'm going to unmute you. Maybe not. Okay, let me get these questions up for you. There's the questions that we've received. Although the second one, the person that asked the above question was answered, so don't worry about the second one. So any discussion about the first one? I think it may have been dealt with. And then the one after number 3. That may have already been answered as well, but Mike, do you have any comments about that one?
About number 3?
Yes.
The answer would be, I think the answer would be no. Yeah, I would toss to the commission members and the Board of Osteopathic Medicine members, but I think the answer is obviously no, but I guess our language is broad enough to include administrative interactions, like making appointments.
You define that later on. I mean, it's not usually a secretary or administrator makes the appointments. Could be a PA perhaps, referrals, but that's a consultation.
Right. I suppose you could make an appointment on the practice's website, and that would technically, without dealing with a human being, and that would technically fall under our definition. I don't know if that's something we need to address or not.
Down the site, I don't, in this, I hate to change the terminology of the general definition. Couldn't it be dealt with later on in the document?
Heather, the commission can always issue a guideline or some type of document, maybe in a Q&A format to supplement its rules and provide that to the licensees, right?
Sure, of course. I think frequently there's some sort of FAQ provided that helps give concrete examples to, sort of show how the rule works.
So the person who asked that question does have their hand raised. So Barry Edwards, I'm going to unmute you so that you may provide some more information on that. It says you are unmuted. Well, hopefully he catches up with us. Okay, so then we have another hand raised from Quinn Sheen.
Yep, that's correct. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was just going to respond in response to whether it's administrative interactions. I think if we do go with a broad definition like the ATA is suggesting, which I agree with, we do, and I know we're just focused on the definition here, and need to think of this term in context of what the rest of the rules will be. So, you know, a physician who uses telemedicine to establish a relationship, or when you're before providing care, provision of care through telemedicine, this whole question of like whether it will capture an administrative interaction or not, we're really going to how the care is going to be delivered and how the provider will be communicating ultimately with the patient. So I understand that we are focused on the definition, but I guess I would caution, having looked at how a lot of states do this, I would caution away from going too narrow, because this definition will need to be used in the context of the rest of the rules. So I don't know if that made sense, but.
Thank you. Okay, so do we want to do any more work on this definition, or do we feel like we have a good working definition to move forward with, and then we can address the 2 comments that are on the agenda?
I think in favor of time and moving forward with the progress, we've got a good working definition if we're adopting previous one.
I agree. So I will get the comment. So Christine, you can now move to that next piece of the script. Thank you.
Right. Okay, we'll discuss 2 of the comments we've received. The first is from OCHIN. The panel will begin the discussion, and if you have a comment, please do as you've been doing, raise your hand and use the raise your hand function. Thank you.
So hopefully everyone had a chance to read these comments, and if you have any discussion to have about this one first, and then we will move on to the other one.
I can address the first recommendation if that would be helpful. The expectation of compensation was in the first draft, which was a remnant from a guideline that was addressing a wholly different issue, and that was the issue of whether a consulting physician needed to be licensed in the state of Washington. And we had said back then that they did have to be licensed if a consulting physician was expecting compensation as opposed to a casual curbside consult. This expectation of compensation requirement is not in the current draft, so it's gone.
So that one's basically been dealt with. And then the second one we've already worked on for the past hour and 15 minutes, so I think maybe it was taken care of as well. And then I think we have addressed this last one as well. What are your thoughts, Mike?
Yes, we have.
All right, so I think we can move on to the next one. Oops, sorry. Don't watch Melanie. Okay, so this is the next one, and actually this DO sent this to both me and to the osteo board, and their comments were very similar on both, so I've included this one.
This is April. In looking at this, the discussion about the peer-to-peer teleconsult. So what I assume the person commenting is remarking about is if I was, as a provider, speaking to another provider in a different state about a patient. And I guess if I was consulting to get an opinion or to discuss a case with another provider for their expertise, I'm not sure that I need them to have a license in my state. I would think that the provider who is interacting with the patient in Washington State would be accountable for what it is they do with the information that they have obtained by their discussion with another peer.
This is Heather, and I have just a comment. The Medical Commission does have a statute, it's 1871-230, that says that if a physician is exempt from having to be required to be licensed, sorry, it's Friday. If they're exempt from licensure requirements and they do practice in Washington, so say they, gave an opinion on a patient, the commission still has the authority to take disciplinary action against that provider. So there is sort of, it sounds like this person is a little bit worried about you might not be able to discipline someone who wasn't licensed here, and there is a provision in statute that allows you to do that. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Got it. And then it sounds like their comments about Section 2 we have already somewhat addressed with the idea of reworking some of our language with regards to consent and where that's necessary and where it is not.
Yeah, I want to add that we're not, in the rule, we're not requiring written consent. We're requiring consent, but it doesn't have to be written. So to answer the question, verbal consent would be sufficient.
I'm not sure that the comment about evaluations of patients who can't consent is something that necessarily needs to be addressed in the telemedicine rules.
Would it be helpful?
Curious about that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. Would it be helpful?
It caught my eye. Oh.
Go ahead, Renee.
No, it's you now. I'm back. Power standoff. That did catch my eye in reading through that particular comment, just because of the use of psychiatry in telemedicine a lot in psychiatry and in a lot of more institutional type settings where people are in altered state. And does consent in that does it need a specific telemedicine treatment in the way consent is done in this section of rules? But then to Mike from there.
Well, I was just going to ask, would it be helpful, would it be useful to put in some type of exception in the informed consent, the draft informed consent rule?
That might be a good idea. I mean, you get psychotic patients, delirious patients who are, say, picked up by the police and end up in an ER. They certainly probably don't have consent, and you can't get true consent for them quickly.
It might be something, Mike, where we could refer to current guidelines regarding consent or inability to obtain consent in these specific types of examples, wherein the telemedicine rules could refer to, that verbal consent is, would be preferred with exceptions as delineated in other rules for situations wherein consent cannot be reliably attained or whatever. I don't know exactly how you do the language, but I'm guessing we have rules already about this. So I would think we could just refer to those.
We don't, but I can come up with some language, Dr. Jager, and maybe you can help me fine tune it.
I'm happy to. I would think that there has to be something that is guiding the practice of medicine wherein we can't get consent. Obviously we have designated crisis responders at the state level who can hold a patient for involuntary care, but in the hours between their arrival for care and the detainment for care, they still have to be treated for their safety, et cetera. Anyway.
That's probably in statute. If it is, I'll find it.
Okay.
Any other comments about this one? All right, well, we do have one more question/comment that I will put up on the screen momentarily. It's very long, so there you go.
Not sure what the question in that is.
Yeah, it's more like a comment.
Yeah, it seems like they're suggesting that the ATA definition is perhaps the better way to go. Like, that's kind of what I took out of that comment.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think it's more of a comment.
I agree as well.
But okay, well taken.
And this is Mike. Getting back to Dr. Jager's comment about informed consent, I pulled up the statute. We have a very long, detailed informed consent statute about obtaining informed consent from patients who are not competent. So I think I can just refer to it in the rule.
Perfect.
Okay, so someone had asked that I put the working definition back up on the screen, so I'm working on that now. Okay, there's the working definition again. And then while we're viewing this, Christine, do you want to go ahead and read the next part of your script?
Okay, so we're done with all comments.
Yes.
Is there discussion of today's agenda items or any questions from the attendees that we have not answered, please?
Oh, we've got 2 hands. Hold, please. Okay, go ahead, Barry Edwards.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. I just wanted to point out the question of location was raised, and I'm very familiar with that whole concept, but I think we have to understand the reality is that the provider is completely dependent on the patient, what they say, where they say they are. The patient could be in another country, another state. Unless they have a selfie video with the Eiffel Tower in the background and they're in Paris, you really have to depend on where they say they are. And they could be straddling the line between Oregon and Washington, or they could be in a car at the beginning of the encounter in Oregon, and 10 minutes into it, they could be in Washington. So this whole business of establishing the location can be kind of stressful for the provider, and it's really not as cut and dried as we seem to assume that it might be.
Any comments from the panel?
I agree as well. And that's just how I agree. I think, I'm not sure it matters with regard to the definition. I think it's something later in the document, perhaps.
And then it looks like Peter Antal has his hand raised again. I think I have unmuted you.
Yeah. I was just going to chime in that technology is getting better in this regard in terms of the location. If a patient is on a smartphone or a tablet and doesn't turn off intentionally the location services, it's relatively easy to capture their current location. The other thing that we tend to do, in no way am I here speaking as a vendor or anything like that, but we tend to ask all patients if they're coming in for medical visits to choose their pharmacy just in case a prescription might be warranted, and that serves as a backup. And of course, we always ask patients at the beginning of any encounter. But just bringing up some practical points, maybe. I don't know that necessarily helps your definitions and all of that, but there are a number of ways. But I also agree with the point that was made earlier. Ultimately, sometimes you do have to rely on the patient being honest and do your best and hope that they're not somehow erroneously giving you bad information.
Thank you. Any comments on that? All right, we've received one more question, and it says, would it make any difference if a patient were driving to Portland during a consultation? At what point can we just trust patients? Any comments on that?
I just trust the patient,
I'm not sure that has bearing with regards to our rulemaking at the moment.
Agreed.
All right. And Christine, you can move forward with, I think there's one more little piece of the script.
Are those all the questions, I guess, that we have?
That
So
is all
thank
we have
you.
so far.
Thank you for your participation. And Amelia will talk about next steps, please.
So our next workshop will be held in either February or March. We are working on scheduling that now. Our main topics will be, should the exemptions to licensure for following up with established patients and peer-to-peer consultation be in our rule? And then we'll also discuss circumstances in which the standard of care may not require an interview or examination of a patient. And then we will likely discuss several of the other comments that we have received. We're trying to address these in small amounts because we've gotten a lot of them. And then another workshop will be held in either April or May. I'm working towards April. And then Jeb from WISMA had asked if there will be an opportunity to talk about next steps, and I see that he has his hand raised, so I'm going to unmute him. Go ahead, Jeb.
Great, thanks, Amelia. And good evening, everyone. I'm Jeb Sheppard from the Washington State Medical Association. I fully recognize what you all are trying to accomplish here, but I just want to raise the issue that the telehealth landscape right now is very, very fluid. You know, we haven't been doing it on this scale for very long, not even a year. And so just to sort of, you know, some examples are on the federal level, CMS just finalized changes to several of their fee schedules. That was about 2 weeks ago. So trying to understand those, you know, the new Congress may have interest in making some of these pandemic flexibilities around telehealth that CMS does not have the authority to make permanent. And then we know MedPAC is also looking at a slew of recommendations for Congress to consider as well. And I think maybe more importantly and closer to home is we know there's lots of interest in this issue at the legislature. There will be several proposals considered, not only around the definition, but around peer-to-peer consultation and other issues as well. And so I'm just wondering if it makes sense to wait and see what they do. The 102 was scheduled to come out right in the middle of the legislative session. So just some concerns around timing that I wanted to raise. And then we've heard several comments on this call in support of standardizing with other states and the feds. And I'm just not certain that running ahead here does much to accomplish that. And there are other open questions we have around, you know, I know this is being coordinated with osteo, but what about the other professions? And there's just some questions we have around, you know, scenarios where there are care teams with different types of providers working under different standards to provide telehealth services. And so just wondering if this needs to be done at a different level. And so I just, to summarize, I think the timeline you've laid out is awfully fast, and the rulemaking is pretty ambitious. And so absent an urgent demonstrable need, we would request that you sort of hit pause until after legislative session when things here in Washington and around the country have crystallized, and we might have a better idea about the direction where telehealth is going. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeb, and I can speak to the timeline a little more. We do sort of forecasting timelines with these rules, but this one we opened last year before the pandemic, and so the timeline has been blown out of the water. It takes us a good 18 months once we get rolling at minimum to complete the 101 portion, which is the pre-proposal of a rulemaking. I don't foresee this one going to the full commission to make suggestions or any changes to the language until at earliest January of 2022. I can't imagine us getting this completed this year. So, and we will certainly want to see what comes out of this session. So I will say that for right now, I don't see that this rule will move any faster than a normal. We're not putting any sort of, we're not lighting a fire under this one. We just happen to start working on it. So does anybody else have any comments on that? All right, and then we have one more hand raised.
Hi, this is David Streeter with the Washington State Hospital Association. I just wanted to echo Jeb's concern about the fast timeline here. You know, as I'm sure you all are aware, hospitals are just really focused on COVID-19 right now, and you know, we really want to make sure that we're, you know, able to engage fully in this process. And so, you know, we would just, you know, echo that recommendation that that we move slow and you know, maybe hit pause until after the legislature. I know Commissioner Farrell mentioned the possible legislation regarding the peer-to-peer consults. We also heard this week that there may be legislation regarding audio only. So, you know, again, just really recommend that we go slow and you know, account for the COVID response in the legislature and also the possible changes that could occur at the federal level, which it sounds like you're doing, but I just wanted to add my add our support to that recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have another hand raised. Laura Lord, I think I have unmuted you.
Hi, thank you so much. And we do appreciate everything you guys are doing for us, by the way. I'm with Renton Pediatric Associates. I just had a very interesting conversation with one of the doctors who was stating, and this is just like part of the reason that we talk about, you know, not having a video component. And, you know, one of the doctors is like, okay, well, I don't know how I'm supposed to even, and I know billing isn't your thing, you guys are trying to define it, but it's like, what am I supposed to do when I was, you know, on the video call for a few minutes, video goes out, I still, you know, continued the phone call, did my recommendation, did everything that I could for the patient. And so that's like something that comes up. We also have like elderly grandparents with their kids trying to do a visit with us. Maybe they don't know how to do video. So there are all sorts of situations where obviously you talked about it not being optimal for patient care and, you know, doing it over video in the first place. But when it is necessary and when we're not trying to expose people to COVID and whatnot, it is really helpful sometimes if that video part isn't required. So that's all I wanted to say, just a comment.
Thank you. Does anyone from the panel have a comment on that? All right, there are no other comments. There's no other hands raised. So you, Christine, you can go ahead and read the next part.
Thank you. If there's no one else that wishes to comment at this time, I will close this workshop and wish all of you a very safe and happy holiday next week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Amelia.
Thanks, Amelia.
Thank you guys so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
I don't know.